Batya, what's on your radar?
Well, if you thought 2 million people illegally crossing our southern border in just 1 year was bad, things are about to get a lot worse. On Wednesday, a Trump-era policy aimed at curbing illegal immigration is set to expire. The policy, called Title 42, was part of a U.S. public health code and allowed Border Patrol agents to immediately turn people back to Mexico due to the threat posed by the pandemic. Under Title 42, the U.S. expelled upwards of 2 million illegal immigrants, meaning that had it not been in place, we would have had well over 4 million illegal migrants enter the country over the last 2 years. Just take a look at this footage from Fox News' Bill Malugin of a night in El Paso, Texas last week. Now, Democrats who oppose Title 42 have ironically decided that we are no longer in a pandemic. Unless, of course, you're a lawyer with student loans, in which case the pandemic-era moratorium on your loans has been extended until June of 2023. The truth is we aren't in a pandemic anymore, but given the Biden administration's lax attitude toward the southern border, Title 42 has been effectively the only means of border control currently in operation, and that policy is now set to lapse after an appeals court denied a GOP effort to keep it in place. Border Patrol agents, border towns, and southern states are bracing for the huge influx of migrants in already taxed systems. El Paso has declared a state of emergency, but they aren't the only ones. Governors of southern states have taken to busing migrants to sanctuary cities, liberal bastions that like to brag about their openness to immigrants. And those cities' authorities have been less than pleased about being asked to put their money where their mouths are. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, for example, released a panicked statement on Sunday about the influx of 1,000 migrants a day that he is expecting to arrive in New York once Title 42 expires. Quote, "Our shelter system is full and we are nearly out of money, staff, and space," Mayor Adams said in his statement. Truth be told, if corrective measures are not taken soon, says Adams, we may very well be forced to cut or curtail programs New Yorkers rely on, and the pathway to house thousands more is uncertain. These are not choices we want to make, but they may become necessary, says Adams, and I refuse to be forced to choose new arrivals over current New Yorkers. Unfortunately, that choice has already been made and not in favor of New Yorkers. The Independent Budget Office projected that the city will spend $600 million a year to provide shelter, education, healthcare, and legal aid to the asylum seekers who have already made their way to New York. Meanwhile, New York City's public housing residents have a backlog of repairs to the tune of billions of dollars, as Daniel Barber, who represents New York City Housing Authority's 339,000 tenants, aptly put it in an interview with the New York Post. The city is going to put forth a ton of money for these people who aren't even citizens, but they forgot about the people who live in public housing right here, says Barber. How is it fair to them to spend their hard-earned taxpayer dollars on illegal immigrants? How is it fair to the working-class Americans struggling to get by? How is it fair to the 40,000 homeless veterans across the nation? How is it fair to legal immigrants or those patiently applying for asylum who can't access our southern border? How is it fair to the families of people dying of fentanyl overdoses from drugs brought in by cartels who have become experts at trafficking humans to distract from their drug trafficking? It's not just in New York. The choice to prioritize economic migrants over American citizens has been made over and over by the Biden administration. In removing every one of Trump's immigration policies, Biden has signaled to eager migrants that the door is open and they will be welcomed with open arms if they cross illegally into the U.S. And it is Americans, American taxpayers, Americans in need of services, American children who rely on public schools, and American workers who rely on American health care, who have been asked to pay for the pieties of this administration without getting a say in it. Immigration advocates argue that Title 42 unfairly denied migrants the opportunity to seek asylum. But the reporting has found repeatedly that the majority of the migrants illegally crossing the border are economic migrants and their families who don't have a legitimate asylum claim. In fact, it's something Nancy Pelosi herself admitted in her infamous comments about how we need these illegal migrants to, quote, pick crops. Ironically, after calling Trump's border policies cruel and inhumane, President Biden now seems poised to start copying Trump. Two proposals in particular seem to be coming straight out of the Trump playbook on immigration, Axios reports. The Biden administration is considering imposing a version of Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, which would bar single adults who cross illegally who have not first applied for asylum in countries they crossed through to enter the U.S. And the administration is considering ramping up criminal prosecutions for illegal border crossing. Recall that then candidate Biden raised his hand when asked during a Democratic primary debate whether he would decriminalize illegal border crossing. The administration is also considering raising the cap on a recently successful program which sends up to 24,000 Venezuelans specifically back to Mexico if they attempt to cross illegally. The program radically reduced the number of Venezuelans attempting to cross, though increasing the cap will rely on Mexico's cooperation. It's not just ironic that President Biden won an election in part by parading his virtue on immigration and portraying his opponent as unbelievably cruel, only to now embrace his opponent's tactics in the face of a crisis of Biden's own making. Democrats cast Trump's base, too, as cruel and hateful bigots for thinking that this country should have a secure border. They called them racist for thinking American citizens should come first. They called them white people obsessed with losing status to, quote, people of color, for wanting a secure border. Leftist journalists and academics and politicians went to great lengths to smear their fellow Americans as hateful, only to have it made clear what their privilege had protected them from having to acknowledge. After all, it is not morality, but privilege that protects you from having to worry about an immigrant taking your job. It's not virtue, but economic security that grants you the ability to put signs in your window saying, immigrants are welcome here. Though, of course, we saw how far those signs got the migrants flown to Martha's Vineyard. You're not a better person than the working class Americans who vote on immigration. You're just richer. But it seems that now even some on the left are finding their voices and able to admit the truth. The southern border is a mess. You can't have a country without a border. It's not cruel to believe this. It is unbelievably cruel not to. Your fellow Americans who are struggling shouldn't have to pay for your pieties. Why don't you learn to spare a kind word for them from your position of immense privilege? So, Amisha, where are you on this question of Title 42?
Title 42 should never have been in existence. Quite frankly, it was something that came about during the Trump administration, largely due to his anti-immigrant sentiment. It never really had a full backing in health or healthcare prevention of things like the spreading of COVID, because we know, just like with the stopping of entrants being able to come to the United States at that time, it did not stop us from having COVID already here in this country. There is no significant amount of COVID that was spread from immigrants coming in. We already know that. Again, as somebody who traveled multiple times during the pandemic to foreign countries and absolutely didn't have COVID, took tests before I went, took the test when I went. The 3 times I got COVID were 2 in New York and 1 in the state of Florida. So I think that we have to understand in context here that it was a piece of policy, again, not in immigration. This is a very separate form of policy. It's not immigration reform policy. It's not immigrant policy at all. It's not codified in that way. It was a piece of policy that I think was ill-informed at the time and something that, quite frankly, put a target on the backs of individuals who were trying to escape some of the most demonstratively horrible, in many cases running from death. You are right in your assessment. Also, economic despair and trying to get some level of help, some level of a reprieve. This is something that I think should have been gone a long time ago. Something that the Biden administration should have taken on as he was coming into office. Not something that we're still discussing right now. Quite frankly, because it was poorly designed to begin with, and there wasn't any methodology that would have made it make sense. We know that immigration reform activists, we know that many, including Congress members themselves, were, at least on the Democratic side, were against it from its inception. And I think that largely it's because there was no through line between immigrants entering the United States and there being this large or sizable form of COVID that was passed between them. It just wasn't factual, and the basis of that was largely anti-immigrant sentiment from the Trump administration.
Well, I don't agree about the anti-immigrant sentiment, but I agree with you that it does seem like this was just a sort of convenient way to do something that I think was very necessary, which is stem the flow, this huge flow, this rising flow of illegal immigrants at the southern border. But I completely agree with you that the rationale never seemed very strong. Certainly now, I mean, you're right. Like it's like either the pandemic's over or it's not, and we do seem to believe that it is over. But I think the point is that right now, what Border Patrol agents have been saying, and what governors of southern states, border states, what they've been saying is that this is really the only means they have of turning people away. And so once this is gone, preparing for, Mayor Adams saying he's expecting 1,000 migrants a day to New York City. I mean, that's a lot of people.
Well, largely this is because of lackluster congressional efforts. This isn't an issue that is, immigration reform isn't something that just came about during the Biden administration, or the necessity to quell some of the southern border entrants isn't something that came about during the Trump administration. We've been battling this for longer than you and I have been alive. And I think that at the end of the day, there has to be an effort on both sides of the aisle in not only addressing the issue, but also the impetus of these undocumented immigrants coming to America to begin with. We know that Vice President Kamala Harris went to the Triangle countries just a few months ago. By all intents and purposes, with the exception of American media, it seems like those conversations went well. But this is a humanitarian crisis for several people. And they are trying their best to salvage their children, save their children, which I think any parent would want to do if you cannot feed them, if they are running from violence, if they have state-sanctioned violence against said families. And our asylum system, quite frankly, has been broken for quite some time. And the former administration, the Trump administration, made it a whole lot harder of a process for many individuals. And I think that we have to revisit that, some of the changes that were made during that administration, but also acknowledge that there are humanitarian efforts and humanitarian relief and a process that we have to go through to ensure that we won't have that influx. Yes, border security matters, but it doesn't take into account the many causes that continue to push people to our southern border.
I mean, definitely. Although I think that it's been cast as racist to say, but my people first. Like, for example, I'm a New Yorker. I want that money to go to public housing. I care a lot about that issue. I think it's really important. The state of those apartments is horrific. None of us would agree to live in such conditions. It's horrible.
But can we not do both, Batya? And I say that because the housing situation and the crisis of housing in New York is not anything new. The crisis of homeless populations in LA or in New York or in my hometown of Chicago. Chicago and the state of Illinois is also a sanctuary state and a sanctuary city. And we don't have Mayor Lightfoot or Governor Pritzker saying the types of things that I'm hearing come out of Mayor Adams' mouth in New York, and partially because of his approval ratings and other things that are kind of shifty, shaky for his administration. He is making some claims that we're not hearing from other leaders of sanctuary cities or sanctuary states. But I also think that when we take this into context, again, context matters. Our veterans issues, veterans homelessness, I sit on veterans boards. I make sure that I'm elevating this issue every single day. Us taking care of our immigrant population or talking about immigration reform in the southern border does not annihilate the need for us to have veteran supports for those who serve valiantly and come back to our country and get nothing. I think that we can do both of these things. And immigration reform efforts have been, decades long. Veterans have been coming back to America and getting absolutely nothing and living on the streets for generations. I think that these are things that we can tackle and need to tackle, but it's not an if or. It is an if and. There is an and here. We don't have to separate them. It is Congress's job, it is America's job to not only take care of our population, the mental health issues that are associated with homelessness, the addiction issues that are a part of the homeless population as well, but also the rising cost of housing. All of these things are domestic issues that we need to take care of. And I think that is very separate from a conversation about immigration reform.
Well, we are going to have to leave it at that, but what fun discussing this with you, Amisha. And we are going to have more Rising right after this.